The Consciousness Code Podcast, Episode 12, Language as a Nervous System Event, Why Words Do Not Just Mean They Land. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. In the last episode, we explored framing, the lens that shapes meaning before thought fully arrives, the way interpretation begins leaning before we realize we're already inside it. In this episode, we move even closer to the moment of contact itself, not just how meaning is shaped, but how it is received. What happens in the body when language arrives, and why words do more than describe reality. They enter it, they register, they shift something, and often they do all of that before we've had time to consciously understand what was said. Because most of us have been taught, either directly or implicitly, that language is something we process cognitively. When someone speaks, we hear the words, we interpret the meaning, and then we respond. But if you slow that sequence down even slightly, you begin to notice that something else is happening first. There is a reaction that precedes understanding, a subtle shift in the body, a tightening, a softening, a pull toward or away. Sometimes it's almost instantaneous, so fast that it feels like part of the meaning itself. But it isn't. It's the reception of the signal before the interpretation has fully formed. And once you start noticing this, it becomes difficult to unsee. You begin to realize how often you have reacted to how something was said rather than what was said, how a tone, a pause, a certain emphasis can change the entire meaning of a sentence even when the words themselves remain the same. Someone can say, that's fine, and depending on how it lands, it can feel like reassurance, indifference, or quiet frustration. The content is identical, but the experience is completely different. And that difference is not happening at the level of abstract meaning. It's happening at the level of the nervous system. You can feel this in your own life. Think of a moment where someone said something, and before you could explain why, you already felt a shift. Maybe a slight unease, maybe a sense of warmth, maybe a sudden defensiveness. And if someone asked you in that moment, what exactly did they say that caused that reaction, you might struggle to answer, because the reaction did not come from a fully formed interpretation. It came from something more immediate, something pre-verbal, or at least pre-analytical. This is the beginning of what we're exploring in this episode. The recognition that language is not just processed, it is received, and that reception is embodied. It happens through a system that is constantly scanning for cues of safety, threat, connection, and disconnection. A system that is far older than language itself, and that responds to tone, rhythm, and implication before it responds to words as structured meaning. This is why you can walk into a room and feel tension without anyone saying anything explicitly hostile. It's why you can sense when a conversation has shifted, even if the words remain polite. It's why a single phrase, delivered in a certain way, can change your entire state in a matter of seconds. The body is reading something. It is picking up on signals that are not fully captured by the literal meaning of the words. And this is where the usual model of communication begins to break down. Because if language were purely about meaning, then clarity of words would be enough. But we know that's not the case. People can say the right thing and still create distance. They can use technically accurate language and still trigger defensiveness, confusion, or withdrawal. And on the other side, someone can say something imperfectly, but in a tone that feels safe, and the message lands in a completely different way. So what's happening here is not just a communication gap, it's a mismatch in how language is being received. Because before meaning is fully constructed, the nervous system has already made an assessment. It has already decided, often implicitly, whether this is safe, whether this requires caution, whether this invites openness or prepares for defense. Once that assessment is made, it shapes everything that follows. It shapes how the words are interpreted. It shapes what is noticed and what is filtered out. It shapes the emotional tone of the response. So by the time you think you are responding to what was said, you are often responding to the state that was created when it landed. This is why two people can hear the same sentence and have completely different reactions. Not because they misunderstood the words, but because the words landed differently in their bodies. One person may feel safe enough to interpret the message generously. The other may feel a subtle threat and interpret the same message defensively. And from there, the interaction diverges. You can see this clearly in conflict. One person says something they believe is neutral or even constructive, but the other person reacts strongly. From the outside, it can look like an overreaction. But from the inside, something in the delivery, the tone, the timing, or the implication triggered a response before the content was fully processed. And now the conversation is no longer about the original message. It is about the state that the message created. This is also why phrases like, "that's not what I meant," appear so often in communication breakdowns, because the speaker is referring to the intended meaning, while the listener is responding to the received signal. And those two are not always aligned. And this is where the concept of language as a nervous system event begins to make sense. Because what we are really looking at is not just a transfer of information, but an interaction between systems. One person speaks and their state is embedded in the way they speak. The other person receives, and their system interprets that signal based on its own current state, history, and sensitivity. So language is not traveling through space. It is moving through a relational field. It is being shaped by the person delivering it, and reshaped again by the person receiving it. And within that exchange, meaning is not simply transmitted. Because what you'll often find is that the interpretation follows the state, not the other way around. This is where something important becomes visible. The idea that we are purely rational interpreters of language begins to soften. because if the body is already organizing the response before the mind has finished understanding, then cognition is not leading the process. It is participating in it. It is making sense of something that has already begun. Once you see that, the entire experience of communication begins to shift. You begin to realize that what feels like a misunderstanding is often misalignment at the level of the state. That which feels like disagreement is sometimes the result of different nervous systems interpreting the same signal in different ways. That which feels like clarity in your own expression may not land that way for someone else, because what you are saying and what you are signaling are not always the same. This is where the responsibility of communication changes. It moves from simply choosing the right words to becoming aware of how those words are being delivered and how they are likely to be received. It becomes less about controlling meaning and more about understanding impact, because impact happens before interpretation is complete. This is the central recognition of this opening section, the one that sets the foundation for everything that follows. The body often responds to language before the mind has finished understanding it. Once you begin to notice that, even occasionally, something shifts. You start to see that communication is not just an exchange of ideas. It is an exchange of signals. Those words are not just carriers of meaning, they are carriers of the state. And that's how something lands in the body will often determine what it ends up meaning, far more than the words alone. From here, we can begin to explore what that actually means in practice. What language is doing as it moves through us. How tone, timing, and implication shape the signal, and why understanding language as a nervous system event changes not only how we communicate, but how we listen, how we interpret, and how we relate to each other in real time. So instead of asking only, what does this mean? We begin asking a different question, what is this doing to me as I receive it? That shift from meaning to impact is the beginning of a different kind of awareness. Once you start to look at language through this lens, you realize that meaning is only one layer of what is being communicated. Beneath that layer, and often preceding it, there is a continuous stream of signaling. Subtle, fast, often unconscious, but incredibly influential. And this signaling is what the body is responding to. This is where the mirror-linguistic hypothesis becomes useful as a framework. Not as a fixed theory, but as a way of orienting toward what is happening in real time. The idea that language is not just something we use to describe reality, but something that functions as embodied signaling between nervous systems. That is when we speak, we are not just expressing thoughts, we are in a transmitting state. And when we listen, we are not just decoding meaning. We are receiving that state often before we realize it, and you can feel this directly. Think about the difference between someone saying, I understand, in a calm, grounded tone, with presence behind it, versus the same words delivered quickly, distracted, or with a subtle edge. The meaning is identical, but the signal is not. And your body knows the difference immediately. You don't have to analyze it. You don't have to think it through. You feel it. This is because tone carries regulatory information. It tells the nervous system something about safety, about intention, about relational availability. In many cases, that information is prioritized over the literal meaning of the words. This is supported by research into prosody, the rhythm, stress, and intonation of speech. Studies in effective neuroscience have shown that prosodic elements of language are processed in brain regions associated with emotion and social cognition, often more rapidly than semantic content. In simple terms, the brain is tuned to pick up on how something is said as a primary signal, because that signal has historically been critical for survival. Before language evolved into complex symbolic systems, communication was already happening through tone, rhythm, and gesture. These were the cues that indicated safety, threat, cooperation, or conflict. Those systems are still active. They haven't been replaced by language. They've been layered beneath it. So when someone speaks, your nervous system is not just listening for meaning. It is scanning for a signal. It is asking, often implicitly, is this safe? Is this aligned? Is this congruent? Is this something I can open to, or something I need to guard against? That scanning happens fast. Faster than conscious thought, which is why you can feel something is off before you can explain why. This brings us into the distinction between congruence and mismatch. When someone's words, tone, and state are aligned, the signal feels coherent. There is a sense of clarity, even if the message itself is complex. But when there is a mismatch, when the words say one thing and the tone suggests another, the nervous system detects that incongruence. And often it trusts the tone over the words. For example, someone might say, I'm not upset, but their tone is sharp. Their pacing is tight, their body is tense. The words suggest calm, but the signal suggests activation. And in that situation, the nervous system does not default to the literal meaning. It responds to the signal. It prepares for tension, for defensiveness, for potential conflict. This is why incongruence can be so destabilizing, because it creates uncertainty at the level of perception. The mind hears one thing, but the body feels another. That mismatch requires resolution. So the system often defaults to the more evolutionarily relevant signal, which is tone, posture, and delivery. This is not a conscious choice, it is an adaptive mechanism. Now, when we bring in mirror neuron systems, we begin to see how this signaling becomes relational. Mirror neurons are thought to play a role in how we attune to others, how we simulate their actions, and potentially their emotional states. While the exact mechanisms are still being explored, the broader principle is clear. Humans are wired for resonance. We pick up on each other's states. We reflect them. We are influenced by them. So when someone speaks from a regulated, grounded state, that state is not just expressed, it is transmitted, and the listener's system, if receptive, begins to align with it. This is co-regulation, the ability of one nervous system to influence another towards stability. But the opposite is also true. If someone speaks from a dysregulated state, carrying tension, urgency, or aggression, that signal is also transmitted, and the receiving system may begin to mirror that activation. This is how escalation happens. Not just through disagreement, but through the transmission of the state. This is happening beneath the level of explicit meaning. This is where pacing and rhythm come into play. The speed at which someone speaks, the pauses they include or omit, and the rhythm of their delivery all contribute to the signal. Fast, pressured speech can create a sense of urgency or overwhelm. Slow, measured speech can create space and calm. Silence, when used intentionally, can allow integration, or when used in certain contexts, it can create tension or ambiguity. These elements are often overlooked because they are not part of the literal content, but they are part of the signal, and the nervous system is responding to them continuously. Now, when we connect this to predictive processing, something even more interesting emerges. The brain is constantly generating predictions about what is going to happen next, based on prior experience. When language is received, it is not processed in isolation. It is matched against expectations. Tone, context, and prior interactions all contribute to those expectations. So if someone has experienced criticism in a certain tone repeatedly, that tone becomes associated with threat. And when it appears again, even in a different context, the system may predict a similar outcome. The frame is applied before the content is fully processed. The signal activates the expectation, and the interpretation follows. This is why the same sentence can land so differently for different people. It is not just about the words. It is about the predictive models that are being activated at the moment of reception. And this brings us into embodied cognition, the idea that cognitive processes are deeply rooted in the body's interactions with the world. Thinking is not separate from feeling. Interpretation is not separate from physiology. They are intertwined. So when language arrives, it is not entering a purely abstract system. It is entering a body with history, with patterns, with sensitivities, with prior conditioning, and that body is actively shaping how the language is received. This is why implication and subtext are so powerful. What is implied, what is suggested, what is left unsaid but felt, often carries more weight than the explicit content, because implication operates at the level of the signal. It bypasses the need for direct articulation and moves straight into the relational field. For example, someone might say you can do whatever you want, but the tone, the timing, and the context suggest disapproval. The words grant freedom, but the signal introduces pressure, and the listener responds to that pressure even if they cannot immediately articulate it. This is why communication can feel confusing, because the explicit message and the implicit signal are not always aligned, and the nervous system is responding to both. So when we bring all of this together, a clearer picture begins to form. Language is not just a system of symbols. It is a system of signals. It carries meaning, but it also carries state. It is interpreted cognitively, but it is received physiologically. It operates through words, but also through tone, rhythm, pacing, and implication. Because of that, the impact of language cannot be understood by analyzing words alone. It must be felt. It must be noticed in the body, in the shifts of state, in the subtle changes that occur as language arrives. This is where the listener's awareness begins to change. Instead of only listening for meaning, you begin listening for a signal. You begin noticing how something lands, not just what it says. You begin to recognize that your reaction may be shaped as much by the delivery as by the content. From there, a different kind of communication becomes possible. One that is not only concerned with clarity of words, but with coherence of the signal. One that recognizes that what you are transmitting is not just your thoughts, but your state. And that's what you are receiving is not just information, but an embodied experience. Which brings us to the core insight of this section, and it's worth holding it not just conceptually, but somatically. Language is not only interpreted, it is received as a signal that shapes the state. Once you begin to notice that, even in small ways, everything about how you speak, how you listen, and how you relate to others begins to shift. Why tone often overrides words. If language is received as a signal before it is fully interpreted as meaning, then tone becomes one of the most important carriers of that signal. Because tone is not just decoration around words. It is not an optional layer that sits on top of meaning. It is often the primary way the nervous system determines what kind of interaction this is, long before the content has been fully processed. This is where a subtle but powerful inversion occurs. We tend to believe that words carry the meaning, and tone simply colors it. But in practice, especially at the level of the body, tone often defines the meaning, and the words are interpreted through it. This is why the same sentence can feel completely different depending on how it is delivered. I'm fine can signal calm, reassurance, and stability when spoken with ease and openness. The same words spoken with tightness, flatness, or sharpness can signal withdrawal, irritation, or suppressed frustration. In that moment, you don't sit there analyzing the semantics. You don't think, well, technically, they said they're fine. You feel something immediately, a shift, a signal that something doesn't quite match. That feeling is not random. It is the nervous system doing what it is designed to do, prioritizing cues that indicate safety or threat, alignment or incongruence, openness or defense. Because from a biological perspective, tone carries far more relevant information than words alone. Words require interpretation. They require processing. Tone, on the other hand, is immediate. It is continuous. It reflects the internal state of the person speaking, and that state is what the listener's nervous system is responding to. This is why tone often overrides content. Because the question the nervous system is asking is not, is this sentence logically correct? It is asking, what is the intention behind this? What state is this coming from? Is this safe to receive? Tone is one of the fastest ways to answer that question. You can see this clearly in moments of perceived threat. If someone says something neutral, but their tone carries sharpness, impatience, or subtle hostility, the body will often respond defensively before the mind has had time to analyze the words. Muscles may tighten, breathing may change, attention may narrow, and from that state, the interpretation of the words shifts. What might have been received as neutral becomes charged. What might have been interpreted generously becomes filtered through suspicion. This is not a failure of communication. It is the nervous system doing its job. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, tone was a primary signal long before complex language existed. Vocal patterns, pitch, intensity, rhythm, these were the cues that indicated whether someone was friend or foe, whether an interaction was safe or dangerous. And those systems are still active. They have not been replaced by language. They are operating alongside it, often taking precedence. This is where the concept of neuroception, introduced by Stephen Porges, becomes relevant. Neuroception refers to the nervous system's ability to detect safety or threat without conscious awareness. It is an automatic process, one that scans for cues in the environment, including tone of voice, facial expression, and body language. So when someone speaks, your nervous system is not waiting for you to consciously interpret the meaning. It is already assessing the signal. It is already deciding how to prepare. That preparation shapes how the words are received. This is why content can be overridden by delivery. Because if the tone signals threat, the system prioritizes protection over interpretation. It becomes less interested in what is being said and more focused on how to respond. And in that state, even well-intentioned or accurate language can be misinterpreted, not because the meaning is unclear, but because the signal has already shaped the context in which that meaning is being processed. This is particularly visible in passive aggression and sarcasm. In passive aggression, the words often appear neutral or even polite on the surface, but the tone carries a different signal. There may be a subtle edge, a slight emphasis, a pacing that suggests something is being withheld or implied, and the listener picks up on that. Even if they cannot articulate exactly what is wrong, they feel it. Sarcasm operates similarly. The literal meaning of the words is often the opposite of the intended message, but the tone signals that inversion. Without the tone, sarcasm would not work. It relies entirely on the listener's ability to detect the mismatch between content and delivery. This mismatch is key, because incongruence between words and tone creates uncertainty. The mind hears one thing, but the body feels another, and when that happens, the nervous system tends to trust the signal over the content. This is why someone can say, "I'm not upset," and still be perceived as upset, because the tone, the pacing, and the micro-expressions are carrying information that contradicts the words. The listener's system is responding to that contradiction. This is also why trust can break down in communication, even when the words themselves are technically correct. Trust is not built on content alone. It is built on coherence, on the alignment between what is said and how it is said. When words and tone match, the signal feels clear. When they don't, something feels off. And over time, repeated incongruence can erode trust, because the listener begins to rely less on the words and more on the underlying signal. They start to listen between the lines. They start to interpret not just what is being said, but what is being implied. This can create a feedback loop, because as trust decreases, sensitivity to tone often increases. The listener becomes more attuned to subtle shifts, more vigilant for signs of mismatch, and this heightened sensitivity can further shape how communication is received. It's important to recognize that tone does not only carry threat, it also carries safety. A calm, grounded tone can regulate the nervous system. It can create space even when the content is difficult. This is why someone can deliver a hard truth in a way that still feels supportive. The words may be challenging, but the tone signals care, presence, and stability. For example, being told this needs to change can feel confronting or constructive depending on how it is delivered. If the tone is sharp or critical, the body may respond defensively. If the tone is steady and attuned, the same message can be received as guidance. So tone is not just about avoiding negative signals. It is about actively shaping the relational field. It determines whether the listener's system opens or closes, whether it prepares to engage or to defend. And that preparation then shapes how the message is interpreted. This is where the relationship between tone and state becomes even more apparent. Because tone is not something we can fully control at the level of words. It is an expression of the state. It reflects what is happening internally. So when someone is dysregulated, their tone often carries that dysregulation, even if they are trying to say the right thing. This is why communication advice that focuses only on wording can fall short. Because you can choose your words carefully, but if your tone carries tension, urgency, or defensiveness, that is what will be received first. This is also why people sometimes say, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. And while that phrase can be overused, it points to something real. The delivery of the message is shaping how it lands. Now, when we bring this back to your broader framework, particularly the mirror linguistic hypothesis, tone becomes one of the primary ways that state is transmitted between individuals. It is part of the signaling system that allows nervous systems to attune to each other. When someone speaks from a regulated state, their tone reflects that. It carries steadiness, presence, coherence, and the listener's system, if receptive, can begin to align with that state. This is co-regulation, but when someone speaks from an activated or dysregulated state, their tone reflects that as well. It carries urgency, tension, or fragmentation, and the listener's system may begin to mirror that activation. So tone is not just influencing interpretation, it is influencing the state, and this is why tone overrides words, because the nervous system is prioritizing the signal that is most relevant for regulation. It is asking, what is happening here? Not just in terms of content, but in terms of relational safety and alignment. Once that question is answered at the level of tone, the words are interpreted within that context. So if the tone signals safety, the words are more likely to be received openly. If the tone signals threat, the words are more likely to be filtered defensively, and this happens quickly, often before conscious awareness has had time to intervene, which brings us back to the core insight of this section, and it's worth holding not just intellectually but experientially. The nervous system trusts tone before it trusts content, and once you begin to notice that, even occasionally, something shifts. You start to hear language differently. You start to recognize that what feels like meaning is often shaped by delivery. You begin to notice how your own tone changes when your state changes. From there, a different level of awareness becomes possible. One that is not just focused on what is being said, but on what is being transmitted. Communication is not just about exchanging information. It is about regulating connections, and tone is one of the primary ways that regulation happens in real time. Language, state, and interpretation. If tone shapes how language is received, then the state determines what that signal becomes. Not in an abstract sense, but in a very immediate, embodied way. Because by the time words reach conscious awareness, they have already passed through a system that is not neutral. They are filtered through physiology, through expectation, through prior experience, through whatever state the body is currently in. And that state is not just influencing interpretation, it is actively participating in its construction. This is where we begin to see the deeper relationship between language and perception. Not as something linear, where words are spoken, received, and then interpreted in a clean sequence, but as something dynamic and reciprocal. The words arrive, yes, but they arrive into a system that is already primed in a certain way. And that priming shapes what is possible to perceive in that moment. This connects directly back to what we explored in episode 11 around framing. Because a frame is not just an idea, it is a state-dependent structure. It organizes perception, attention, and interpretation before conscious reflection has time to widen the field. And the state is what determines which frames are most available. So when language arrives, it does not land in an open field. It lands in a pre-structured one. A field that has already been shaped by emotion, by context, by internal conditions, and from within that field meaning begins to emerge. This is why meaning is not fixed in the words. It is not something that exists independently of the receiver. It is something that is co-created in the moment of reception. The same sentence, spoken in the same way, can land completely differently depending on the state of the person receiving it. Not because the words have changed, but because the interpretive system has. You can see this in something as simple as a neutral comment. Imagine someone says, "You didn't reply to my message." On the surface, that is a factual statement. It carries no explicit judgment. But depending on the state of the listener, it can be received in very different ways. In a regulated state, it might be heard as an observation, perhaps even an invitation to respond. In a more sensitive or activated state, it might be heard as criticism, as accusation, as evidence of failure. And in a deeply dysregulated state, it might be interpreted as rejection, as confirmation of not being enough, as something that triggers a cascade of defensive or self-protective responses. The words have not changed, but the meaning has. Because the meaning is not in the words alone. It is emerging from the interaction between the words and the state in which they are received. This is what we mean by state-dependent interpretation. The idea that perception is not static, but fluid, shaped by internal conditions, and this is not just a psychological observation. It is supported by research in effective neuroscience and predictive processing. The brain is not passively receiving information. It is actively generating predictions about what that information is likely to mean, based on prior experience and current state. And those predictions shape what is perceived. So if the system is in a state of threat, it is more likely to interpret ambiguous input as threatening. If it is in a state of safety, it is more likely to interpret the same input as neutral or even positive. This is not a conscious choice. It is a function of how the system is organized at that moment. This is also why conflict can escalate so quickly. Because when two people are interacting from different states, their interpretations of the same exchange can diverge dramatically. One person may be speaking from a place of frustration, but still intending connection. The other may be receiving from a place of sensitivity or prior hurt, interpreting that frustration as rejection or attack. And as each person responds from their own interpretation, the interaction can spiral, not because either person is intentionally escalating, but because their states are shaping how the language is being received and responded to. This is where the bidirectional nature of this process becomes clear. Language shapes the state, and the state shapes how language is interpreted. It is not one or the other. It is both continuously influencing each other in real time. A word can shift the body can shift the meaning of the word. And this loop continues, often outside of conscious awareness. You can feel this in moments where your state changes mid-conversation. Perhaps you begin in a calm, open state, and then something is said that triggers a subtle shift. Maybe your breathing changes. Maybe your attention narrows. Maybe a sense of defensiveness arises. And from that point on, the same conversation starts to feel different. The same words begin to carry more weight. You may start to read into things more. You may become more reactive, more guarded. The content has not necessarily changed, but your state has. And that change is now shaping how everything is being interpreted. This is also why misinterpretation is more likely under dysregulation. Because when the system is activated, it is prioritizing speed and protection over nuance. It is looking for patterns that match prior threats. It is simplifying, categorizing, and narrowing. In that process, subtlety can be lost. Ambiguity can be resolved too quickly in the direction of perceived danger. Neutral or even positive signals can be filtered through a lens of threat. This is not because the person is irrational. It is because their system is operating under a different set of priorities. It is trying to keep them safe based on what it has learned. And in doing so, it may over-apply certain interpretations. This is where emotional filtering comes into play. The idea that our emotional state acts as a filter through which information is processed. When we feel anxious, we are more likely to notice and remember information that confirms that anxiety. When we feel secure, we are more likely to notice information that aligns with that sense of safety. And this filtering is not something we choose. It is something that emerges from the state of the system. So when language arrives, it is not being processed in isolation. It is being filtered, shaped, and sometimes distorted by the emotional and physiological context in which it is received. This is also why certain patterns can become self-reinforcing. If someone is consistently in a state of insecurity, they may interpret neutral interactions as negative, which then reinforces that insecurity. That reinforced state then shapes future interpretations, creating a loop. And over time, that loop can stabilize into a way of seeing the world. Not because it is objectively accurate, but because it has been repeatedly confirmed through state-dependent interpretation. This brings us back to the idea that internal state shapes perception, not just in isolated moments, but as an ongoing process. The way we feel influences what we see, what we hear, what we remember, and how we interpret what is happening around us. This is where awareness becomes important, not as a way of controlling interpretation, but as a way of noticing the conditions under which interpretation is occurring. Because if you can begin to recognize that your current state is shaping how you are receiving language, something shifts. You may not immediately change the interpretation, but you create a small amount of space around it. Instead of assuming that what you are perceiving is the full picture, you begin to consider that it is one possible interpretation, shaped by your current state, and that consideration alone can soften the rigidity of the response. This is not about dismissing your experience. It is about contextualizing it, recognizing that meaning is not fixed but fluid. It emerges from an interaction between words, tone, context, and state. When we bring this back to the core insight of this section, it becomes clearer. Meaning is not fixed in the words. It emerges from the state in which they are received. This does not make language meaningless. It makes it relational. It highlights that communication is not just about what is said, but about how it is received, and that reception is always shaped by the state of the system. Once you begin to see that, even in small ways, something opens, because you start to recognize that interpretation is not absolute, that there is room for variation, for reconsideration, for widening the frame, and in that widening, the possibility for different responses begins to emerge. Not because the words have changed, but because the relationship to them has. Language in relationships, regulation or escalation. If language is not just something we use to exchange meaning, but something that actively shapes nervous system state, then relationship become one of the clearest places to observe this in real time. Because in relationships, language is not abstract, it is immediate. It lands in a shared space, a relational field where two nervous systems are constantly influencing each other. Within that field, language either supports regulation or contributes to dysregulation. It either steadies the interaction or destabilizes it. This is why communication in relationships is rarely just about getting the words right. It is about what those words are doing between two people in the moment they are spoken. It is about whether the interaction is moving towards safety and understanding, or toward tension and defense. And that movement is often shaped less by the content of what is said, and more by how it is delivered, when it is delivered, and the state of the people involved. Because every conversation is happening within a state context. Two people are not just exchanging sentences. They are meeting each other from within their current levels of regulation, sensitivity, history, and expectation. When those states are aligned or compatible, communication tends to flow more easily. There is more room for nuance, more capacity to listen, more flexibility in interpretation. But when those states are mismatched, communication can quickly become strained. This is where escalation cycles begin. An escalation cycle does not usually start with a dramatic event. It often begins with something small. A comment, a tone, a perceived slight. One person feels a shift, perhaps subtle at first. A tightening, a sense of being misunderstood, a flicker of defensiveness. They respond from that state, maybe with a slightly sharper tone, or a more guarded choice of words. The other person picks up on that shift. Their system responds in turn, perhaps with its own defensiveness or withdrawal. And before either person has fully processed what is happening, the interaction has moved into a different register. Now, the conversation is no longer just about the original topic. It is about the states that are being activated and mirrored between the two people. This is why arguments often escalate in ways that seem disproportionate to the initial trigger, because the escalation is not being driven solely by the content. It is being driven by the interaction of two nervous systems responding to each other's signals. Each response becomes input for the next reaction, and the cycle builds. Tone plays a significant role here. A slight edge in delivery can be interpreted as criticism. A raised voice can be perceived as a threat. Even subtle shifts in pacing or emphasis can signal irritation or impatience. And once those signals are detected, the receiving system may move into a more protective state. From that state, interpretation narrows and responses become more reactive. This is where language begins to shift from regulation to escalation. In a regulated interaction, language tends to support connection. It creates space, it allows for clarification. It acknowledges the other person's experience without immediately defending against it. For example, saying, "I can see that this matters to you," does not necessarily mean agreement, but it signals recognition. It tells the other person that their experience has been noticed, and that signal can help stabilize the interaction. In a dysregulated interaction, language often becomes more rigid. It moves toward accusation, dismissal, or defensiveness. Phrases like "you always do this" or "you're overreacting" may emerge. These are not just statements, they are signals that the interaction has shifted into a more adversarial mode. They tend to narrow the conversation, to reduce complexity, to assign fixed roles. And once those roles are activated, it becomes harder to move back into a more open space. This is where validation and dismissal become important distinctions. Validation does not mean agreeing with everything the other person is saying. It means acknowledging that their experience exists and makes sense from their perspective. It is a way of saying, "I can see how you got here, even if you do not fully share that view." And that acknowledgement can help regulate the interaction because it reduces the sense of being unseen or misunderstood. Dismissal, on the other hand, tends to have the opposite effect. When someone feels dismissed, their system may interpret that as a form of relational threat. It can trigger a need to defend, to push harder to be heard, or to withdraw completely. And from that state, communication becomes more difficult. This is why repair is so important in relationships. Repair is the process of recognizing that something has shifted and taking steps to bring the interaction back toward regulation. It might involve acknowledging a tone that came out more sharply than intended. It might involve clarifying what was meant. It might involve pausing the conversation to allow both people to settle before continuing. But repair requires a certain level of awareness. It requires the ability to notice that the interaction has moved into dysregulation. And that is not always easy, especially when both people are activated. This brings us to the importance of timing and readiness. Not every moment is a good moment for every conversation. Even if something is important, if one or both people are in a highly activated state, the likelihood of misinterpretation increases. The capacity to listen decreases. The ability to hold nuance is reduced. And in that context, even well-intentioned language can land poorly. This is why sometimes the most regulating thing to do is to pause, to recognize that the current state is not conducive to productive communication, to create space for both systems to settle before re-engaging. This is not avoidance, it is strategic timing. Because when both people are more regulated, the same conversation can unfold very differently. There is more room for curiosity, more willingness to consider alternative interpretations, and more capacity to stay present even when the content is challenging. This also highlights how breakdowns in communication are often not simply failures of wording, but mismatches in nervous system state. Two people may be using clear language, but if their states are out of sync, the interaction can still break down. One may be seeking connection, the other may be in protection. One may be ready to engage, the other may be overwhelmed. And in that mismatch, signals can be misread, intentions can be misinterpreted, and the interaction can become strained. This is where the idea of language as co-regulation becomes particularly relevant. When two people are attuned, language can help align their systems. A calm tone can settle tension. A well-timed acknowledgement can reduce defensiveness. A pause can create space for integration. In this way, language becomes a tool for stabilizing the relational field. But when attunement is absent, or when both people are dysregulated, language can have the opposite effect. It can amplify tension, reinforce defensive patterns, and push the interaction further into escalation. This is why awareness of the state is so important in relationships. It is not enough to focus on what is being said. It is also necessary to notice how it is being said, and from what state it is being delivered, and equally to notice how it is being received and what state is shaping that reception. Because once you begin to see that, something shifts. You start to recognize that not every reaction is about the content, that sometimes what is being responded to is the signal, not the words. You begin to notice patterns, moments where tone changes the direction of a conversation, where timing influences whether something is heard or resisted. From that recognition, a different kind of choice becomes possible. Not a perfect choice, not a controlled or scripted one, but a more informed one. One that takes into account not just what needs to be said, but how and when it might be received. This is not about becoming overly cautious or avoiding difficult conversations. It is about understanding the conditions under which those conversations are more likely to be productive. In the end, relationships are not just built on shared understanding. They are built on shared regulation, on the ability to remain connected even when there is disagreement, even when there is tension, and language plays a central role in that. It is one of the primary ways we influence each other's states, one of the main ways we either support or disrupt the relational field. Which brings us to the core insight of this section, and it is worth holding clearly. Language either regulates the relational field or destabilizes it. You start to see communication differently, not just as an exchange of ideas, but as a process of mutual regulation, a continuous shaping of the space between people, moment by moment, word by word, tone by tone. Nervous system language, NSL. If everything we've explored so far begins to shift how language is understood, then this section brings it into something more practical, more observable, and more usable in real time. Because once we recognize that language is not only meaning but signal, and that it shapes state as much as it communicates content, a natural question emerges. What does it look like to work with language more consciously at the level of the nervous system? This is where nervous system language, or NSL, becomes useful as a working lens. Not as a rigid method, not as a set to memorize, but as a way of noticing and adjusting how language is used and received in relation to the state. NSL begins with a simple but often overlooked premise, that language is not neutral in how it lands. The same idea can stabilize or destabilize the body depending on how it is expressed. Because of that, wording, tone, pacing, and delivery are not secondary details. They are part of the message itself. So NSL is not about choosing nice words or avoiding difficult truths. It is about recognizing that every word carries a signal, and that signal interacts with the nervous system of the person receiving it, including your own. One of the clearest entry points into NSL is the distinction between soft and sharp language. Sharp language tends to be absolute, compressed, and often identity-based. It uses words like always, never, you are, this is in ways that close down interpretation and increase pressure on the system. For example, saying you never listen to me is not just a statement. It is a signal. It carries finality. It suggests a fixed pattern, and the nervous system receiving it is likely to interpret that as criticism or attack, which can trigger defensiveness. Soft language, by contrast, tends to be more specific, more contextual, and more open. It allows for variation. It describes experience without collapsing it into identity. For example, sometimes I feel unheard when I'm speaking carries a different signal. It still communicates something important, but it does so in a way that leaves space. It reduces the likelihood of immediate defense and increases the possibility of engagement. This is not about weakening language. It is about adjusting the signal so that it can be received. Another key distinction in NSL is the difference between naming states and judging identity. When language moves quickly into identity, you're selfish, I'm broken, they're difficult, it tends to stabilize a fixed interpretation. It turns a moment or a pattern into something that feels permanent. That can narrow both perception and possibility. Naming states, on the other hand, keeps the experience more fluid. Instead of you're selfish, it might become that felt important to you in that moment, or I felt like my needs weren't considered there. Instead of I'm broken, it might become I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm struggling to process this right now. The difference may seem subtle at first, but at the level of the nervous system, it is significant. Because identity-based language often carries a heavier load. It can reinforce patterns, solidify narratives, and reduce flexibility. State-based language, by contrast, keeps things in motion. It acknowledges what is happening without locking it into something fixed. This also connects to how we speak internally. NSL is not only about how we communicate with others, it is also about how we communicate with ourselves. The internal language we use shapes how we experience our own state. Saying I'm failing carries a very different signal than this isn't going the way I hoped. One collapses the experience into identity. The other keeps it as a situation that can be understood and adjusted. Again, this is not about avoiding truth. It is about recognizing that the way something is worded influences how it is processed. Another important element of NSL is pacing. The speed at which language is delivered affects how it is received. Rapid, pressured speech can increase activation. It can create a sense of urgency or overwhelm, even if the content itself is neutral. Slowing speech, introducing pauses, and allowing space between thoughts can have a regulating effect. It gives the nervous system time to process. It reduces pressure. It creates a different rhythm in the interaction. This is something you can feel directly. When someone speaks quickly, without pause, it can be harder to track, harder to integrate. When someone speaks with a slower, more measured pace, it often feels easier to stay present, even if the topic is complex. Silence also becomes part of NSL. Not as absence, but as space. Space for processing, space for response. space for regulation. When used intentionally, silence can allow both speaker and listener to remain connected without rushing to fill the gap. It can prevent escalation by interrupting reactive patterns. But when silence is used in a different state, perhaps as withdrawal or avoidance, it can carry a very different signal. So again, it is not just the behavior, but the state behind it that matters. This brings us to conscious delivery. If language carries state, then how something is delivered becomes as important as what is said. And conscious delivery is not about performing or controlling every aspect of communication. It is about becoming aware of the state you are speaking from. Because if you are speaking from tension, urgency, or defensiveness, that state will be transmitted, regardless of how carefully you choose your words, and the listener's system will respond to that signal. So NSL invites a simple but powerful question before speaking. What state am I in right now? Not as a judgment, but as an observation. Am I regulated? Am I activated? Am I trying to resolve something quickly? Am I open to the response, or am I already bracing for a certain outcome? Even a small amount of awareness here can change how language is delivered. It can create a pause, a moment of adjustment, where the signal becomes more aligned with the intention. This is particularly important in moments of tension. When something feels urgent, the impulse is often to speak quickly, to resolve, to push through. But if that urgency is coming from activation, the signal may escalate the interaction rather than resolve it. Slowing down, even slightly, can shift the entire dynamic. This is not about suppressing expression. It is about aligning expression with a state that allows it to be received. Another aspect of NSL is recognizing when someone else is not ready to hear. This is not always obvious at the level of words. Someone may say they are listening, but their tone, posture, or pacing may suggest otherwise. Their system may be too activated, too defensive, too overwhelmed to fully process what is being said. In those moments, continuing to speak, even if the content is important, may not be effective. The signal may not be received as intended, and this is where timing becomes part of communication. NSL does not just consider what to say, but when to say it. It recognizes that receptivity is state-dependent. The same message can land very differently, depending on whether the listener is regulated or dysregulated. And sometimes the most skillful move is to pause, to allow space, to return to the conversation when both systems are more available. This is also where NSL connects back to the broader idea of co-regulation. When two people are interacting, their nervous systems are influencing each other. Language is one of the primary ways in which influence occurs. So speaking from a more regulated state, using language that reduces unnecessary pressure, pacing the interaction in a way that allows processing, all contribute to a more stable relational field. This does not guarantee agreement. It does not eliminate conflict, but it changes the conditions under which those things occur. It makes it more likely that the interaction remains within a range where both people can stay engaged. This is where NSL begins to move toward intentional communication, not in the sense of controlling outcomes, but in the sense of being aware of the impact of language beyond its literal meaning, recognizing that every word, every tone, every pause is part of the signal being sent. From that awareness, making small adjustments, choosing words that describe rather than define, naming states rather than collapsing into identity, slowing speech when needed, noticing when urgency is driving delivery, recognizing when the other person is not ready to receive. These are not dramatic changes, they are subtle shifts. But over time, they can significantly alter how communication unfolds, because they change the signal, and when the signal changes, the response often changes with it. This brings us back to the core distinction of this section, and it is worth holding clearly as a practical anchor. It's not just what you say, it's the state you speak from and the signal you send. Once that becomes part of your awareness, even intermittently, communication starts to feel different, less like a battle of meanings and more like a process of attunement, less like something to get right and more like something to stay present within. Because language, at this level, is not just about being understood. It is about how we meet each other moment by moment through the signals we send and receive. Integration, listening for what words are doing, not just what they mean. If this episode has been building toward anything, it is this shift. Not a new technique to memorize, not a new rule for communication, but a different way of listening, a way that moves beneath content, beneath surface meaning, into the level where language is actually being received and processed in real time. Because by now, something should be clearer. Words are not just understood, they are felt. They are registered in the body before they are fully interpreted in the mind. And if that is true, then conscious communication begins not at the level of choosing better words, but at the level of noticing how those words land. This is where somatic listening begins. Not listening only for meaning, but listening for impact. Not just tracking what is being said, but tracking what is happening in you as it is being said. The subtle shifts, the tightening, the opening, the sense of ease or unease that arises before you have had time to explain it to yourself. Because that response is not secondary, it is not noise, it is part of the signal. And most of the time, it happens so quickly that we move straight past it. We hear something, feel something, and then immediately interpret it, react to it, build a story around it, without pausing to notice the sequence. But if you slow that sequence down, even slightly, something becomes visible. First, there is the contact, the moment the words arrive. Then there is the response, the bodily shift. And only after that does interpretation begin to form, the meaning you assign, the narrative you construct, the reaction you prepare. And in that small gap between contact and interpretation, there is awareness. This is where this entire episode begins to come alive in practice. Because if you can begin to notice what you feel before you fully understand what was said, you start to see how much of your interpretation is being shaped by your state. You start to recognize that your reaction may not be coming purely from the words, but from how those words are interacting with your current condition. So one of the simplest but most powerful questions you can begin to hold is this: what do I feel before I understand what was said? Not as something to answer immediately, but as something to notice. Because sometimes what you feel will be tension, sometimes it will be openness, sometimes it will be confusion, irritation, curiosity, or something harder to name. But whatever it is information. It is part of how the language is landing. Once you begin to notice that, another layer opens. You begin to see that you are not only reacting to content, you are reacting to tone, to pacing, to implication, to everything that carried alongside the words. So the next question naturally follows: do I react more to tone or content? For many people, if they are honest, the answer is tone. Not because they are overly sensitive, but because the nervous system is prioritizing the signal that carries the most immediate information about safety, intention, and relational alignment. This is why a neutral sentence delivered sharply can feel like criticism, and a difficult truth delivered with care can feel supportive. So when you listen somatically, you are not trying to ignore tone. You are including it. You are recognizing that it is part of what is being communicated, and that your response to it is not arbitrary. But then something else becomes visible. You begin to notice that your state is shaping what you hear, that the same tone, the same words, can land differently depending on whether you are calm or tense, open or guarded, grounded or overwhelmed. So another question begins to emerge: how does my state shape what I hear? This is where interpretive awareness deepens. Because instead of assuming that what you are hearing is the full and objective meaning of what was said, you begin to recognize that it is one version of meaning shaped by your current condition. This does not invalidate your experience. It contextualizes it. It allows you to hold your interpretation with a little more flexibility, a little less certainty, a little more curiosity. From there, something subtle but important shifts in how you respond. Instead of reacting immediately, you may pause, not to suppress your response, but to include more information in it, to recognize that there may be multiple layers at play. What you are responding to may not be only the words, but the way they landed in your system. That pause, even if it is brief, can change the trajectory of an interaction, because it interrupts the automatic loop. The loop where words land, trigger a state, and that state immediately produces a reaction, which then becomes the next input in the interaction. When you bring awareness into that loop, you create space, and in that space, you can begin to ask a different kind of question. When do my words regulate, and when do they escalate? Because listening is only one side of this. The other side is recognizing that you are also sending signals. That's your words, your tone, your pacing, and your timing are all shaping how your communication lands with someone else. Just as you are affected by the signals you receive, others are affected by the signals you send. So as you begin to notice how language lands in you, you can also begin to notice how your language lands in others. Do your words create space, or do they create pressure? Do they invite engagement, or do they trigger defense? Do they stabilize the interaction, or do they intensify it? Again, this is not about getting it perfect. It is about becoming aware of the patterns. Because once you see that your language has this kind of impact, you begin to relate to it differently. Not just as a tool for expressing thoughts, but as a way of shaping the relational field. This is where the final question in this section becomes particularly important. What changes when I listen for signal, not just meaning? Because this is the shift that brings everything together. When you listen only for meaning, communication can feel like a puzzle to solve, a matter of interpreting correctly, responding accurately, and getting the words right. But when you listen for a signal, something else becomes available. You begin to notice the relational dynamics, the shifts in state, the underlying tone of the interaction. You start to see communication not just as an exchange of information, but as an exchange of regulation. From that perspective, the goal of communication begins to change. It is no longer only about being right or being understood in a purely cognitive sense. It is about staying connected, about maintaining a level of regulation that allows for real exchange to occur. That does not mean avoiding disagreement or difficulty. It means recognizing that how those things are communicated matters as much as what is being communicated. This brings us into the integration takeaway, and it is simple, but it carries depth. Conscious communication begins when you notice how language lands, not just what it says, because that is where awareness enters the process. That is where you begin to see the layers beneath the surface, the interaction between words, tone, state, and interpretation. Once you see that, even intermittently, communication is no longer something that just happens to you. It becomes something you are participating in more consciously, not controlling, not perfecting, but noticing. From that noticing, responding with a little more awareness, a little more flexibility, a little more space, which brings us to the close of this episode. If we step back and look at what has been explored, a few key points begin to stand out. Language is not purely cognitive, it is physiological. It is processed through the body as much as through the mind. The nervous system responds before interpretation is complete. Before you have fully understood what was said, your body has already registered something. Tone, timing, and implication shape meaning. They are not secondary to words. They are part of how those words are received. Communication breakdown is often not about poor wording alone, but about mismatched states, about signals being sent and received from different levels of regulation. Awareness of how language lands is foundational to conscious interaction, because without that awareness, we remain inside automatic loops of reaction and interpretation. But with that awareness, even in small amounts, something changes. You begin to hear differently. You begin to speak differently. You begin to recognize that communication is not just about meaning, but about impact, and that recognition opens the door to something deeper. Not just better communication, but more conscious participation in how meaning is created, shared, and lived, which leads naturally into where we go next. In this episode, we have focused on how language lands in the body. How is it received as a signal? How it shapes state and interpretation in real time. But there is another layer to this. Not just how language lands, but how it begins to organize your internal world. The words you hear repeatedly and the words you use internally do not just pass through you. They build something. They shape what feels possible. They influence what feels true. They begin to define what you can feel, think, and become. So in the next episode, we move into that space, into the words that build your world, not just what others say to you, but what you say to yourself. How naming shapes experience. How inner language stabilizes emotion, and how the words you repeat begin to define the boundaries of your reality. Because language doesn't just land, it builds. So as we close this episode, I leave you with this. Notice not just what is said, but how it lands in you. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, you've been listening to the Consciousness Code podcast, episode 12, Language as a Nervous System Event. Why words do not just mean they land. I'm James Miller.